very excited to hear this presentation as well. So we'll have 16 minutes for our presenter, and then we'll have time for Q&A, so please be thinking about questions, comments, feedback that you'd like to give. And then after, at the end of that, I will invite Dr. Halloran up to say a few words about Matthew, and also present him with his quarantine stool. So thank you guys for being here.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Today I'll be presenting my thesis on power of the prosecutor. Why are district attorneys in Texas refusing to prosecute the death penalty? So really briefly, I'd like to talk a little bit about my topic and why I chose it. The death penalty has been a topic I've been interested in since my sophomore year of high school. My theology teacher exposed me initially to the topic, and since then I've been trying my best to learn about it and how it works in our system. Turns out it's very complicated and full of various steps that I just don't realize happen. And I've also studied some cases. I read Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, which was about a man who was wrongfully convicted of capital murder, and then he was almost executed before his innocence was proven. And I also took a death penalty class with my mentor, Dr. Halloran, which really exposed me to all the intricacies and years of precedent that lead up to executions. So originally my thesis was supposed to take the form of a documentary. For different reasons I'll get into later on, it did not. But on March 9th, 2023, I was actually in attendance of the execution of Arthur Brown. Arthur Brown was convicted of 4 murders, including the murder of a pregnant woman. And I went to the Huntsville Jail Correctional Facility where they have all the executions in Texas to interview some protesters that were there both in support of the death penalty and those that were not in support of the death penalty. So really briefly, I would like to show a clip of some of the interviews that I conducted. So Dr. Halloran, if you'd like to pull that real quick.
I don't think that we have the right from a legal perspective or a moral perspective to take the life of other people. I don't think that is something that we should be able to do.
America is a plethora of people now, coming into this country, and death is not going to be the thing that leads them. So if we can remove death, they're already incarcerated. This guy's been incarcerated 20 years. You can hold him for 50 years. You can hold a guy for as long as you want to hold him. What compels you to kill him? Especially when every governor has an option not to kill. Why are they choosing to kill? That puts you at the same mind frame as the killer, because he had an option not to kill too. He chose to kill.
We waited for this day for 31 years. Too long to wait. Too long, and the pain will never go away, never ever.
Yeah.
Does tonight bring some closure for y'all?
A little.
A little.
It's nothing compared to
Having her here.
for what has happened. But I'm glad justice was finally served.
To me personally, Texas is an execution state. So we're not here for your personal opinion. We need you to sign what you need to sign. Whether you believe in it or not, you chose to be a judge on that bench. And again, Texas is an execution state. So if you're not willing to sign that, I don't believe you should be sitting on that bench.
Or maybe think about it. If it was your loved one, maybe you would have signed 31 years
Right.
ago. Or not dragged it along this entire time. 31 years is a long time. A long time.
My aunt suffered every day for this. She finally gets some peace. It's not bringing her daughter back, but at least it's some sort of peace.
So as you heard, I interviewed, the first lady you saw was Jane. She was a defense attorney in Houston who has been in attendance of several executions since 2015. And then you heard from Charles Keith, who's been a longtime advocate against the death penalty. Charles's brother, Kevin Keith, was wrongfully convicted of a capital murder and almost was executed before his innocence was proven. So he had a lot of experience with that process. And then the last clips you heard were from the victim's family. As you heard, they waited for that day for 31 years. It did provide some kind of closure, but it kind of finally put an end to that whole process. So leading into that, and the bulk of my research revolves around this joint statement that was signed in February of 2022. It was signed by 57 district attorneys across the country and 3 in Texas. The joint statement basically went out to say that there are inherent flaws in the way the death penalty is carried out currently in America, and that they refuse to pursue new cases based on certain criteria and themes that they identified. So, like I said, 3 in Texas signed this joint statement, which is a huge shift in the narrative. As you heard from the victim's family, Texas is traditionally an execution state. So whenever you think of Texas, it's tough on crime. It's executing those who they believe deserve to be executed. And the 3 district attorneys that signed it are Jose Garza, who is Travis County's district attorney, John Cruzat, who is the district attorney of Dallas County, which is in Dallas, and then Mark Gonzalez of Nueces County in Corpus Christi. So I'm going to break down the statement in a couple of themes that I used to center my research. As you see at the bottom, they refuse to seek the death sentences against individuals with cognitive impairments. Mental and cognitive issues is a big theme that they touch on, because if you don't fully understand the impacts of your actions and you have diminished culpability, you don't understand why you're being executed. That goes against everything that the punishment sets out to do. So without that understanding, it would be inherently unjust and cruel and unusual, violating 8th Amendment rights. Next, the statement addresses a couple more themes. The first being arbitrariness, which is the seemingly random application of the death penalty in some cases. Death penalty cases can range from crimes such as a drug deal gone bad, or the armed robbery of a convenience store, to the cold calculated murder of 6+ people in which they were slowly and heinously killed. So there's a big range in the application of the death penalty, and it seems to be a little unfair and unjust in the way that it's implemented. They also touch on some childhood and general trauma that can make a person turn into a killer. They might not have had those thoughts before, but trauma has resulted into them not being able to fully understand their actions. And then intellectual disabilities, specifically from birth, the people that were born that had intellectual disabilities, they also don't have a full understanding of what they did, nor why they would be killed. And then they also touch on insufficient counsel, which is a problem all across the criminal justice system, but specifically in death penalty cases, which a vast majority of cases use a public defender. Public defenders do not have as many resources as private defense counsel, and public defenders aren't as motivated to continue to work with the capital cases the best as they can as a private defense attorney would. Next, they touch on racial bias. They have a couple statistics that I'll go into in a little bit, but it shows a very disproportionate application of the death penalty against persons of color versus their white counterparts. And then lastly, innocence is a very important issue in the death penalty, because you cannot revive someone that has been executed. If someone has been proven innocent after they've been executed, it goes to serve no justice and further diminishes the confidence that we have in our system. And then lastly, they reinforce their commitment to fighting the death penalty. This is an evolving process. And while the statement says that they are refusing to prosecute death penalties going forward, they are committed to being in the long haul for this. So next, some brief literature. There's a number of important Supreme Court precedents involved in the death penalty, but 2 very notable ones are Furman versus Georgia, which in 1972 briefly abolished the death penalty because it was determined that it was cruel and unusual in the way it was being applied. Arbitrariness was much more of an issue. It was seemingly applied at random. This was before the death penalty was only applied to murder cases, so there were rape cases, robbery cases that people were being executed for. And then Gregg v. Georgia in 1976 reinstated the death penalty on a couple conditions. First, it had to target the worst of the worst. which is a very subjective standard, but they kind of said that you could call it like you see it, just determining that this person is truly the worst of the worst among us. Then they included the bifurcated trial system, which basically separates the court trial proceeding from a guilt innocence phase and then to a sentencing phase. So the guilt innocence phase is your traditional court setting where you determine guilty or not guilty. And then if determined guilty, they move into a separate sentencing phase where the jury will determine, is this person particularly heinous and are they a continuing threat to society? So that would determine if they were to be executed or not. And then it would be up to the jury to determine if they were truly the worst of the worst. And then in my death penalty class, I read the book Arbitrary Death by Rick Oglesby. He was a prosecutor in Arizona and dealt with a number of death penalty cases, ranging, like I said, from somewhat, not routine murders, but murders that are more common versus the particularly terrible ones. And then McFarland 2017 found that it was about $1.12 million more to carry out the execution of an inmate rather than housing them in general population for life without parole. Next, Redley and McCock in 2009 found that the death penalty does not work as a deterrent. They compared states with death penalty statutes, without death penalty statutes, and compared their murder rates per capita and found that it really does not work as a deterrent for a number of reasons. But the main focus of the death penalty is to stop people from committing crime out of fear of being executed, but that simply was not the case. And then a couple quick statistics from the Death Penalty Probation Center in 2022. It was found that 44% of all executions and 58% of those sitting on death row are persons of color, which is disproportionate to the white counterparts. And since 1976, 21 white defendants have been executed for killing a black victim versus 299 black offenders who killed a white person. And then lastly, going back to innocence, for every 9 people executed, only one was proven innocent. So that means that innocent persons have been executed. And then Texas Coalition Against the Death Penalty in 2021 found that, in a poll of Dallas County, found that 63% of voters in Dallas would support a decision to stop seeking death penalties in all cases, and that 75% of them would actually prefer to see a person in prison for life without parole instead of seeking an execution. So my methodology, I identified a few samples. I was able to interview John Cruzat of Dallas County, he's the district attorney, signed the statement. Joshua Reese, he's the chief of the Harris County District Attorney's Office of Post-Convictions. And then Kristen Kular, the executive director of the Texas Coalition Against the Death Penalty. And the 5 things that I identified pulling from the joint statement were prosecutorial discretion, arbitrariness, mental health / mental illness, public perception, and racial bias, all themes touched on in the statement. So the intended interview process, going in, I had a vision of, like I said, making this into a documentary, being able to interview a number of different perspectives. And so my goal was to interview the 3 district attorneys that signed the statement and 3 who did not sign the statement. So I'd ask them questions regarding their sentiment towards the death penalty, the sentiment towards other district attorneys, and the themes that were identified in the statement. And the interviews were, like I said, supposed to be recorded and made into a documentary. And then really briefly, some of the questions that I asked, on the left, those questions I would ask those who signed the statement, and then the ones on the right were the ones who did not sign the statement, basically touching on their feelings towards the statement being published, and then how that would impact the death penalty process, not just in Texas, but across the country. So the reality about what actually happened, it took a long time. Turns out death penalty is a very touchy subject. A lot of people don't want to comment on it. And since the district attorney is an elected position, it's very difficult for them to speak freely about some certain topics, and they were not as inclined to speak to a college student. So, but those who did accept did on several conditions. Each interview ended up not being the same format. I was looking for a question-and-answer format, but for example, John Cruzat's interview, I sent him the interview questions with the intention of him reviewing it and be like, okay, this is good to go. But he actually filled them out on a Word document, which is still very useful information, but not what I intended. And then Joshua Reese, he kind of turned into a semi-structured, free-flowing conversation where he just kind of talked about the certain themes that I brought to him. And not really question answer, but Kristen Gular's interview was a question answer format. And my analytical strategy with this is a content analysis. So I would use a program that we have here at St. Ed's in Vivo. I would make a transcript of the interviews and then pull quotes about the certain themes that were addressed. And then I would then take the quotes and analyze them compared to what was said in the statement. So results from those who did not sign the statement, so being Joshua Reese, he said Harris County is tip of the spear. They actually take every execution case to a cabinet committee, and it's a committee made up of several people from several different backgrounds, and they would review each case to ensure that everything was just and fair. And then he does believe that death penalty still has a place in Texas. Next to those who did sign the statement, coming from Dallas County, he believes that the death penalty is still an option. Dallas County has actually executed 3 persons this year, and while there were past convictions, he still wants to enforce those death penalty sentences. And he believes he is still fulfilling the wishes of his constituents based off of the polling that I identified earlier. And then speaking to Kristen Gular, she believes that it's a huge shift in the narrative towards the death penalty in Texas. The use of the death penalty is waning statistically, so at its peak in the 1990s, there were 100 plus executions in a year, but now there are less than 5 happening in Texas. So it has been dropping dramatically, but there are still death sentences that have been handed out. And then quickly on some limitations, like I said, people didn't want to talk. The district attorney is very political position, so they didn't. Part of my research was to see what they thought about other district attorneys signing, but they did not want to comment on that. And so in conclusion, death penalty sentences are given out at a much slower rate than ever before. This is due to many issues, but specifically the rate of sentencing has been very sparse in the last 2 years. In 2022 and 23, only 5 death sentences were imposed in Texas, coming from none of the counties that signed the actual joint statement. So what's important to draw from this research is that while district attorneys do, within their discretional powers, have the ability to not prosecute the death penalty, they are not the final decision makers on this. They're supposed to enforce legislation and enforce laws that have been written through the Texas legislature. So at the end of the day, it is ultimately up to us. For example, there was an execution last night, the execution of Brent Brower. It was not very widely televised or advertised. I'm sure not many people knew about it, but it is still an issue that's happening today. And it's important for voters to recognize that this is not a thing of the past. This is happening now, and it's within our power to be able to stop it or to continue to refine the process. To not let it lead into the hands of district attorneys, but to bring it back into ours as voters. Thank you.
Great job, Matthew. We have time for some questions or comments from the crowd, please.
First of all, that was absolutely amazing. The juxtapositioning of the different people within that clip was particularly powerful. That is just awesome, and I strongly encourage you to continue with that documentary. The second part is what particularly struck me was the terming of the worst of the worst. I thought that jurisprudence in the United States would have been a little more specific about something like that. Is that still the case, the metric used to determine these things? I do have a pretty second question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that is still very much a part of the system. It is, like I said, very subjective. It causes numerous problems because what I believe to be the worst of the worst crimes may not be the worst of the worst of somebody else. And while juries are supposed to agree on this, it's all it takes is one holdout. And no one wants to see a convicted killer walk. And so there's a lot of give and take when it comes to it. But yes, the worst of the worst, very subjective standard, and that is definitely something that should be refined more in legislature.
And then just a second question is, I was really struck just by how much power district attorneys have. It's a little unsettling. It definitely makes me want to become a more informed voter as well. But are there any discussions happening at the moment about trying to diffuse that authority? Or is this a matter that, as you see it, can only be solved through voting? Is it going to stay this way for a while?
Yeah, actually recently with the recent Texas legislative session, they did House Bill 17, which basically gives voters the ability to fire elected officials. This was a lot of pressure coming from Governor Abbott that was somewhat targeted towards Jose Garza and his more expanded use of prosecutorial discretion. I mean, it applies to every part of the system. You know, cops will bring in a case with sufficient evidence to convict, and sometimes cases will just get dropped because attorneys or prosecutors don't want to push it through. So there are some measures being taken right now to kind of rein in discretion, but it is a very important part of the system, and without discretion, there will see more backlog than ever. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you. All right, well then I'm going to invite Lisa Holler, Dr. Halloran up to say a few words about Matthew, and then Stoll.
Congratulations, well done. You made me very, very, very proud. Matthew has been a student in many, many of my classes, and always an honor to have him in class. He asks a lot of great questions, very thoughtful, and I love that. This, as you know, is a subject that's dear to my heart, so I was very happy when you chose it. Also, you really got to go through the process of how discouraging research is sometimes. I mean, he tried. This man tried and tried and tried and tried. And so you still did very well. So congratulations.